Hey everyone, Sean here again, and I'm going to be covering part 2 of Understanding Genesis. And I'd like to start with a verse from Proverbs, which says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter." This really is a very special verse to me because on my journey in the last few months, I've really started to uncover so much that was hidden from me, and I really want to help other people out there see and understand what the scriptures were telling us. Again, because our foundation needs to be set in truth, and it is your responsibility to find that truth. Remember that every man and woman will work out their own salvation in fear and trembling. You cannot rely on other people to tell you. You need to find the truth for yourself. Even what I'm showing you here, I'm really just giving a foundation and a platform, and I'm hoping that you will take it further and you will search for more answers and more truth. So I'm moving on to the next topic, which is, were there giants? And it's funny to ask that as a question, because if you read the Bible the way that God told us, He said, "Come to me like children," and you read that, you'll see that throughout the Old Testament, it talks about giants all the time. It's not vague about it. It says there were giants. Yet so many Christians out there don't want to believe that that's what it actually says. So I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail here to try and elaborate on some of the verses in the Bible and unpack it so that you can see that that is exactly what it's talking about. And again, it is based on, if you understand the part 1 of my videos, where the beginning started with fallen angels coming and taking wives for themselves, which is what happened. If you don't believe that, then it's way easier for you to dismiss that there were in fact giants. So I'm going to start off with some of the biblical measurements. I think this is also part of the problem. When you read the scriptures, you see things like cubits and shekels and spans and ophars and omars and ephahs, and you don't know what it is actually talking about. These were the common measurements and the common ways of explaining measurements in the old days. So the cubit's the most common that you'll find in the Bible when it talks about a length of something, and it roughly translates to the length of a person's arm from the elbow to the fingertips. So obviously that could vary from person to person, but we'll even use the conservative value of about 450 millimeters. That's the smallest that is normally used, but it could be 500. And I'm going to start off with the description in the books of Samuel of Goliath of Gath, where it tells us that he was the height of 6 cubits and a span. And if you do the math on that based on those descriptions I gave you earlier, it's roughly about 2.7 to 3 meters height, or 9 to 10 feet. And because it's not massively oversized for a person, a lot of people simply dismiss that as being maybe an exaggeration. Yet there's never really, you haven't seen a person that tall, have you? And I believe that the other descriptions of his armor was also left there as a clue for us, that he was not just a normal big man, he was superhuman. It tells us that he had a male coat which weighed 5,000 shekels. And again, people read that and be like, okay, that's nice, and they move on. That's because they don't understand what that actual weight meant. The same applies to his spearhead. It says that he had a weight of 600 shekels of the iron spearhead. And I did a bit of research and I found this interesting article where some archaeologists had uncovered some copper spearheads in a cache in a city in Israel. It's called Kafar Monash. I'll put a link to the the site that I found this at, so you can go look for it yourself. But what's interesting is that they found these spearheads where the typical spearhead would be something ranging from about 20 centimeters to 35 centimeters. But amongst these, they found one which was extremely large. It was 66 centimeters long. And when I say the archaeologists that wrote reports on this, they basically said that this was way oversized for what would have been a traditional spearhead. So it baffled them, which I find funny, because if you read the Bible and you know that there were giants in the lands in those days, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But what I found interesting was that this spearhead weighed 2 kilograms in weight. And if you compare that to Goliath's spearhead, his weighed 6.9 kilograms for his spearhead. So it was even heavier than this oversized spearhead. And again, I also did just a basic search on what the average weight of chainmail was. And for an average chainmail that a man would have been wearing, it would have weighed in the region of 10 kilograms, whereas Goliath's was 58 kilograms. That's what the 5,000 shekels translates into. 58 kilograms. All right. So I have no doubt that this is all put in the Bible to give us an indication that this was, in fact, not just a big man. It was a superhuman. Okay. He was much bigger and much stronger. And if you move on to the other references in the Bible, I'm not going to read all of these. I'm going to leave it on the screen for you to, but just, go and take a look at all these different verses in the Bible. It's throughout Deuteronomy and Chronicles. All right. So I'm going to focus on the verse in Deuteronomy of Og. Okay. Og is also one of the very easy to decipher characters in the Bible, because it says that he was a remnant of the giants. So again, quite plainly saying giants. And what I've done over here is also highlighted using this eSword, the Strong's Concordance, because this is important to understand, is that when it talks about the giants, in Hebrew, it was referred to as the Rapha. Okay. And the Rapha, as a description, okay, is what it ultimately translated into the Raphaim. Okay. One of the things about the king of Bashan, also just while I'm on him, is that it tells us that his bed was 9 cubits by 4 cubits. Again, if you do the translations, so I've actually only done it to the feet in this case. So yeah, I found a graphic, but it's roughly 15 feet by 6 feet. Even if that was his bed, so maybe, he wasn't as long as his bed, he might have been 13 feet. It's still massively oversized for a normal person. Okay, so you can't argue that. And the fact that his bedstand was made of iron was obviously an indication that it wasn't made of wood, because it wouldn't have held his weight. Okay. Why I was highlighting the fact that the reference of the giants most commonly will be Rapha is because if you go all the way back to our very first verse that I mentioned in part 1, it talks about the giants in the earth in those days. But if you actually look at what the Hebrew word was, it was Nephil. It wasn't giants. Okay. And the Nephil were only mentioned twice in the Bible. Okay. Once over here in Genesis 6, and then another time in the book of Numbers when the Israelites went to spy out the land. Why this is important is, again, going back to the very first discussion in part 1, where if you look at the Nephil, okay, I've got another website that I recommend you go and look at. I'll put the link at the bottom, but it helps you to use the same Strong's numbers to go and just dig a bit deeper as to what these words are. And for example, with the Nephil, the root word for Nephil comes from Nephal, which means to fall. So I strongly believe that where it says there were giants, it obviously doesn't say giants, it says there were Nephil. I read it as there were fallen ones in the earth in those days. The fallen ones being the fallen angels. Because I believe it's the same as when in the Bible, the Lord no longer calls Lucifer by his name. He became Satan. The same thing with the sons of God. They were no longer sons of God anymore. They became the fallen ones. And if you look at the bottom on the right there, it kind of gives a little description, says that those who used to interpret the passage in Genesis of the fall of the angels, they will use the word Nephil either as Nephilim or the fallers or the rebels or the apostates, which is basically what they were. Okay. So I find this an important point to hammer on, because when you read these scriptures and you read what it says, you need to try and understand what was being told to us. And there's a reason why these two instances weren't specifically saying there were giants or we saw giants. They saw the fallen angels. Okay? And then they also saw the sons of Anak, which came from the fallen angels. So read it with new eyes and new understanding, and it will help you formulate the rest of what's happening in Genesis and in the Old Testament for that matter. And again, I'm going to labor on this point for a while, because I need you to understand that this is the narrative that was being explained to us. For example, in the book of Jude, it talks about the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation. A lot of people read that and think that that's relating to when Satan and the angels were kicked out of heaven. I don't believe that is, because it specifically says that these guys didn't keep their habitation. They left it on their own. And it tells us that they're being reserved in everlasting chains, waiting for judgment. And also an important notice or point to note over here is that it says that even as Sodom and Gomorrah, it's relating to their punishment and their sin, because it says, and after going after strange flesh or a different kind of flesh. So it's telling us that, they were a angelic creation that went after humans to procreate with them. There's another example in 2 Peter where it, again, has a very similar message. It says, "For God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell." Again, using the reference with Sodom and Gomorrah. So I believe that Jude was somehow taking the same message that Peter had spoken of and was repeating it. Why I've got this particular verse here as well is also to highlight that this word hell over here, where it says, "but cast them down to hell," it doesn't state hell. Okay, this was written in Greek as Tartarus, and it was only used once in the Bible. Again, you can see at the bottom there, if you were to search for that particular word Tartarus, it was only used once, and it's because these angels that committed this particular sin were cast down and imprisoned in a very special prison, which was Tartarus. And you can see there's actually a description. It's the deepest abyss of Hades. Again, if anyone spoke about hell in the New Testament, it was normally Hades that was used as the word. And again, I want to highlight that these words were used for very particular purposes. So I hope that if you could spend some time just mulling over this information and going back and reading it yourself and just contemplating it, you'll start to see the picture forming that this is the true narrative of Genesis. And again, why it is important is that your foundation of understanding needs to be based on the truth, not a skewed deception. It does make such a big impact on the rest of your understanding of the Bible. and it made a very big impact on my understanding when I continued reading. In particular, when you talk about the Israelites going into the lands and killing all the men, women, and children, I could never understand that. I didn't understand how God could tell these people to go in and just murder everything and everyone, until you realize that it is about cleansing the land of hybrids, of a abomination that God couldn't allow to continue. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you at part 3.